I have two video files here that I want to show you some options of how we could apply alpha and luma to. And basically, we're going to use my body outline and my body shape to fill with some sort of other video. And in this case, we don't have a green screen. And so this is an option of what we could do if we don't have a green screen. This is a more tedious and intensive process. If you have a green screen, that's obviously the best option. I don't care about lower frame rate, is I want to bring this into After Effects and set it to a lower frame rate. So we'll do that first. I can file, import. And we'll this one. I also know that I want to have this at probably just 1920 by 1080 scale. This footage is that, except vertical. You can see up here, it's 1080 by 1920, and so I mean we could keep it at that, but my new composition, I'm gonna have it at 1920 and 1080. And let's just set this to 12 frames a second. You could keep it at 24. That will ultimately create a bit more work for you in our next step. All right, so by default, this is, if we go to interpret footage main, this is 29.97. That's a typical frame rate for video. And if we put it into a composition, we can click right here to our composition settings. If we put it into a composition that is 12 frames a second, when we export this, it's going to render out as just 12 frames a second. So that will be beneficial. I drag that there, and that gives me the end of my render area. I'm going to open Media Encoder. Once Media Encoder is open, I can come here to Composition, add to Media Encoder queue. I'll flip back to Media Encoder, and we wait for it to show up. Sometimes this takes a moment. So in Media Encoder, it did take probably about a minute for it to show up. I paused the recording. I'm gonna come in here and just make sure that I'm getting the file output that I want. All right, so I can come up here, and this isn't gonna be a PNG sequence. I'm going to export it as H.264. Don't need the audio. This should be fine. Let's just make sure we know where saving. So I want to make sure I change the save location. I'm going to just put it on my desktop for this, and I'll say spin. And it should render pretty quickly. Awesome. Now, if I import that file, then we'll see if we right-click and go to Interpret Footage Main, we can see that it automatically is set to 12 frames a second. Usually, anytime that you import video, it will be set to the 29.97. So next step that we want to do is we want to open that spin video that we just created into Photoshop. So we need to open it in an important way. We're going to just open the interface of Photoshop, and then go to File, Import, Video Frames to Layers. And what we're going to do is, what I said, a bit of a tedious process of going a little bit frame by frame and selecting the image that we want to keep. So I'm going to hit OK. From beginning to end. If you use a very long selection, then it's not going to fit. So small amount of seconds is important, and also important to change it back to 12 frames a second, because if we're working at 24 frames a second or 29, it's going to produce double the amount of frames. So I say okay. You can see here it was about 7 seconds, so it should be 12 times 7, which seems roughly accurate, right? And I don't know if I want to do all 81 layers. We'll probably do a lot fewer. So it's a pretty easy process to select myself. The object selection tool, I can come over here, I can click on myself. Takes a moment. And there we go. So it selected me automatically, very easily. And what I'm going to come and do down here is I'm just going to make a mask. So I have myself selected. I can hit this mask button, and now I'm isolated, right? So I can start looking at these frames and seeing how much difference there is. And still, even at 12 frames a second, when we're breaking it down to individual frames, there's like so little movement that's occurring. Especially at the beginning, because I was going slow, right? So I might actually just delete layer 2, maybe even delete layer 3. I'll start with layer 4. Come back in here, select. And I'll hit the mask. And the reason we're doing the mask is because if there was a funny selection that wasn't working well, I could come back in here and I could come on my mask and I could use black or white and I could add 2. See, you can see that I'm painting on my mask down here, and it's starting to add the wall surface area behind me because I'm painting white onto the black. And we're talking a little bit about the Luma effect and how this is essentially a Luma mask or a Luma matte in Photoshop. That's how these masks kind of work, is by using black and white or values, basically gray values. But I don't want that, so I'm just gonna go back to there and go to layer 5, click. There we go, and I'll hit the mask again, so I'm gone, or it's isolated, sorry. And for them, there's like just the tiniest bit of wall and floor in this, right? But for the purposes of what I'm going to show you, that's not important. I'm going to pause and I'm going to go ahead and continue to do this, probably up to maybe like 20. Or maybe I'll get at least one loop, and then we'll come back. All right, so it's 4:50 now. I started that process at 4:42. So, and I got to layer 46. So it took 8 minutes, and I was just turning on the next layer, selecting the object myself, and then hitting the mask, and then moving on to the next one. And so you can see it can go pretty fast. Part of the reason why it went so fast is because the masks were pretty, they didn't need much adjustment to them. So like you can see when I select this here, the outline is really good. That's partially just because there's nice contrast. I'm against a white background. The Photoshop is reading what the object is really well. So if you have a more complicated background, of course, it might give you issues. If you do need to add or subtract, you can come over to the magic wand tool and we can say, oh, I want to add. And so now I've added a lot more, which I actually don't want that. So I'm going to Command Z, but you can always make adjustments to your mask. And the reason why we're not deleting and why we're making masks is because we do want to be able to have the option to come back and adjust it if we need to. So I'm going to actually just delete these and we'll save this. Save it on the desktop and I'll say spin. And it's definitely not a PDF. We're going to save it as a Photoshop document. So PSD. Okay. Now if we go back over to After Effects, I'm going to import that file that we just created. So go down to my spin PSD and I want to say composition retain layer sizes. I think that this would be the best way for us to explore how to work with it now. There is, of course, the option to import as a Photoshop sequence, but for now, I just want to import as a composition. So I'll hit OK. Composition, retain layer sizes. And you can see when I imported, it brought in a folder that now contains all of the layers in my Photoshop document. And it also has the composition. I'm going to double click on that composition. You can see it looks very similar to how it looked in Photoshop. The reason why I wanted to bring it in as a composition is because I really want to show you this next step. I think this is really useful and beneficial in a lot of ways. I'm going to scroll down in the timeline area and hit layer 1. I'm going to scroll back up all the way to 48. So this, and shift select, I want to select all of them. So this is all of our layers. So if I come over here now, I'm going to drag this back. I can drag this and move it all the way down to where it's basically invisible. And that's going to create it. All the layers are going to be one frame. We do want to make sure that this composition is also set to 12 frames per second. So I can come up here to spin composition settings, and it is at 12 frames a second. So that's great. Now what I can do, next step, my dog is walking around trying to get my attention. So all of them are 1 frame a second. I'm going to right click or control click, say keyframe assistant, sequence layers, and hit OK. And now we'll see it's created a stair step of all of my layers, which is great. And if we want it to loop, I'm going to go to the end of where my layers are, and I'm going to hit the letter N on the keyboard. That will automatically bring the work area to that space. So hitting the letter N, or you could just drag that blue bar. So now if I play, I'm getting my animation of me moving around. And what we can see if we turn on this toggle transparency grid, we can see all of my background is transparent, which is nice. So the next step that we'll want to do is we'll want to make a new composition, we can say new composition, and I'm going to call this full animation. 12 frames a second, that's great. Or we can say full vid if we're thinking more about video. Now I can take my composition spin and drop it in here. And I can use this as an alpha layer for another video that we're going to look at. Why we did this over here in Photoshop and how it affects After Effects, why we made masks. So if we wanted to make an adjustment to our mask at this point in time, so I'm looking at my very last frame and I'm selecting the mask section. And let's say I want to remove my head. I can come to my paintbrush, make sure that I'm using black, and make sure that I'm painting on my mask. And I can remove my head. And I'll say file save. If I save this now, I'm going to go back over to Photoshop, or I'm sorry, After Effects. And you can see it's updating right there. It was flickering just a second ago. It was updating all the frames. So if I go to my last frame, you can see the head is missing now. So it's really nice how Photoshop and After Effects kind of work together. I'm going to Command Z and I'm going to save. And I'm going to go back to After Effects, see it flickers, and here is my head again. Now remember, we had just made a new composition. We can make new compositions by hitting this button right here. We had made a new composition. We had called it full animation, and this is my animation right here. I have all this timeline space, which probably isn't what I want. I could do a couple things. I could just drag this to the end right here, wherever my frames stop. But that's probably not the best way to do it. I'm going to Command Z. What I can actually do is I can go back to my spin. And here, if I have my blue work area at the end of my last frame, I can right click in this section up here and say trim comp to work area. Now, if I go back to my full animation where I had dropped my spin in before, you see it no longer extends the entire way. It's just this one little section. So that's great. So I do 2 spins. So now this is kind of cool on its own. This is kind of like what a green screen could do, but much faster. But I wanted to also show the idea of what the alpha matte can do. So remember, the alpha of this image is literally the outline. It's kind of the mask that we've created in here, right? And so if I import a video file, I have this video file of water. So we have the water file now. I'm going to drop it down underneath my spin. And if I come over here, I have track mattes available. And this little button down here in this lower left-hand corner, if you don't have track mattes available, you can click on that and it will open it up. So I'm going to take the video footage that I want to fill my body with and change this from none to alpha matte. And so we remember an alpha is taking the shape of our object and treating it as a matte. So alpha matte now, and now we could start to do some other things. We could take the water again, and because there's really no difference now, we just stacked that underneath. So what we would want to do to make a change is we could come in here and go to hue saturation. Put that on our mask layer perhaps, and we could change the hue. So moving like that, we could do a lot of different things regarding treatment for the video footage. But something that we could also explore is the idea of moving this video footage around, and that takes an extra step. If we want our video footage to stay inside of the shape. So that takes a step of pre-composing. So I'm going to select these together, right click, and say pre-compose, and this is going to make another composition which will be added to our project panel. I'm just going to say spin matte. And now when I have this selected, my spin matte, you can see it's added over here to our project panel. So if we go inside of this, we get another tab here. You can see what that did. We just have our two pieces together now, the matte and the footage. But I'll go back to my full animation, and I could start to manipulate this in any way that I wanted. If we come into transformations, I can hit position here. And then if I move to the end of my spin, I could drag it over. And we see that we're already starting to get some interesting movement. And remember this, so remember we can also trim that comp. So we could come here to spin matte, hit N, trim comp to work area, come back to full animation, and now this is a little easier to probably look at and work with. So I'm just going to hit Command D, that duplicates. I could drag this here. I could drag another hue saturation on. I could shift this. And maybe Command D again, drag that. I don't need to put hue saturation back on. I can shift it. So I'm starting to get some interesting movement just by duplicating and delaying, dragging the time down just a little bit, and kind of like just letting it do its thing. We could, of course, add other animations if we want as well. There's scale, rotation, opacity, if we wanted to fade one out, fade one in. So those are some initial ideas of how we can start to use this process, especially if we don't have a green screen and we just want to go through a little bit of the tedious process of selecting some frames directly on Photoshop.